Thank you, Ruth. This paper seeks to explore Baptist attitudes to professionalism in ministry in both historical and current thought. It will describe some of the challenges posed by professionalisation of Baptist ministry and hopefully some of the benefits. It will then argue for a nurturing professionalism and secure professional identity in Baptist practice, which can benefit ministers, congregations and society at large. And it is part of a wider study into professional identity in Baptist ministry and the potential benefits of standardising certain aspects of formation. It comes from a desire for a more secure learning environment for Baptist ministers to develop their skills and to teach each other. So to begin a paper on professionalism, it is helpful to explore what we mean by this term. A dictionary definition has two strands to it: the competence or skill expected of a professional and the practicing of an activity, especially sport, by professional rather than amateur players. This definition implies that a professional person has some sort of specialised training and that they are paid for the role that they play in society. We might want to add that society expects certain levels of behaviour from those professional people. Professional sports people are expected to behave in a way that honours their sport, and other professionals in a way that behoves their place as respected people in society. Baptists have standards that churches have always demanded from their ministers, albeit some of those have changed over the centuries. I sit on the National Minrec Committee and I can't remember anyone being thrown off recently for encouraging dancing or cockfighting. The former two aspects, training and remuneration, have historically caused us a few more problems. Supporting ministers with education and finance was the subject of much debate amongst General Baptists until in 1702 the General Association made plans to establish an academy. However, the uneducated state of Baptist ministers was still a problem towards the end of that century. As Anthony Cross highlighted in his work, for ministers to be useful to their congregations, and useful is a word he uses a lot, the communities they found themselves in, they needed to be educated, trained, and free to make it their main occupation. And whilst a general education is something we can now take as given for anyone in Baptist ministry formation, the need for specific skills and training to be useful to the church remains. As over 2 centuries later, the professional qualities of competence and integrity are still being argued for by Paul Goodliffe in his work, Shaped for Service, in 2017. He says, "The good minister is both proficient at the tasks of their calling and righteous in their living." It seems that Baptists still recognise the need to affirm the traits of professionalism, but for very good historical reasons, we are reluctant to use the word to describe what we would expect of our ministers. The rise of ministry as a profession in the 19th century brought with it status and a distinction from the people ministers were trained to care for. And this doesn't sit comfortably with Baptist understanding of the priesthood of all believers. However, in seeking to distance ourselves from that kind of understanding of ministry, we may have lost something vital in the way that we train and nurture Baptist ministers. So let me declare at this point my auto-ethnographical position. Before becoming a minister, I was a nurse in the NHS for over 20 years. My training and subsequent development as a health professional had key aspects which shaped the person I became in that role. From the beginning of my training, we were taught that our uniform meant something. I trained at the Royal London Hospital in the Dark Ages, where we wore starched aprons and frilly hats. We wore them with pride, and we were expected to behave in certain ways while wearing it. And in the East End of London in the 1980s, it even conferred a kind of protection due to the esteem that nurses were held in by the local criminal world. The Krays still had a lot of influence, and if you touched a nurse, you had to answer for it. So the police actually encouraged us to wear our uniform with our uniform raincoat when we walked around through London. Unthinkable now. We were also taught that part of being a health professional was the ability to pass on skills and competencies to others, and to be honest about our own skill deficits. So when I first stepped onto an acute medical ward at the beginning of my training, I was hopelessly ill-equipped. And there were times when this felt dangerous and frightening. But there was always the professional safety net of being required to flag up when I was not competent in a certain area of care. This was all vital to the safety and confidence of the patient and their family. Sometimes the patient and their family were teaching you how to do the thing you needed to do. My initiation into ministerial training was not as clear-cut. I was shocked at the outset to be allowed to effectively serve as a minister and perform key pastoral tasks without any direct supervision by someone more qualified. Whilst the things that I was doing were not so life-threatening as the tasks I was learning as a nurse, they still had the potential to bring emotional and spiritual damage if done badly. In contrast to my early days as a student nurse, no one was checking what I was doing. This has troubled me. And whilst I am well aware that each experience of ministry formation is unique, and that some, including myself later in my training, are blessed to have been supervised by some very conscientious and experienced ministers, this is not something we standardise for those training to become Baptist ministers. Professional standards in the key tasks of ministry, birth, marriage, death, and the sacraments in between, are taught but not observed regularly in practice. Anthony Clark's 2021 book, Forming Ministers or Training Leaders, has some very helpful insights into the variety of approaches to Baptist ministry formation in our colleges. His Venn diagram, which hopefully you can see on the screen now, depicting preparation for Baptist ministry, was interesting to me in what it leaves out as much as what it defines. When I first came across this diagram, it seemed to articulate well my experience of formation and subsequent development as a minister. And as I continued through my training, I remember feeling that with the help of the college that I was moving towards the centre of the diagram and feeling more and more at ease with my new role. But what also struck me about this diagram was that the centre had been left empty. For me, this blank space was the natural home for professionalism, not a privileged and aloof status beyond the people we are called to serve, but rather a place where calling, spiritual development, and the hard work of learning skills converge to form a professional persona. This persona is free to be unconsciously competent and skilled in the areas of ministerial life, so that instead of being consumed with thoughts of how to do a certain thing or behave a certain way, the professionally competent minister is free to be attentive to what the Holy Spirit might be saying in these same situations, to be free to engage in a spirituality of presence. Osmer outlines an ability of the congregational leader or minister to fully attend to the otherness and pain of the person they are with, and what God might be saying in the midst of that pain and suffering. A similar idea was encouraged throughout my nursing training, where we were aiming as practitioners to become unconsciously competent in basic nursing tasks, so that we were able to tune into the patient and their experience and emotional needs. The skill was only one facet of the interaction between patient and nurse, but it was vital that the skill was there as a part of the transaction or relationship. Focusing on the skill alone will minimize that relationship, but holding the skill as part of the relationship can be liberating. Of course, setting professionalism as a goal of ministry formation in this very deliberate way does not give us a standardized blueprint for what that professionalism should look like. Ronald Osborne describes the North American phenomena of a changing picture of ministerial professionalism. He offers the images of master, builder, pastoral director, manager, and therapist as ways of understanding how, over the centuries, ministry has formed its professional identity in response to the needs of society. In a largely uneducated pre-industrial world, the minister was a master and educator. When education and social mobility became part of the congregation's experience, building new congregations and a pioneer mentality seemed to be the pattern of the professional minister, mirroring the pioneering spirit of the secular society it served. In more recent times, we can perhaps all recognize the mantle of spiritual director, manager, and therapist. These roles have perhaps contributed to our confusion about our identity as professionals. They appear to be more of a reaction to the secular world than a conscious decision on our part as ministers. In identifying with other professional models, we have, in my view, brought more confusion than clarity to the concept of professional ministers. Barbara McClure argues that our attitude to pastoral care in our churches has changed perceptibly in the last 20 to 30 years in response to some of these concerns. She suggests that the image of the professional caregiver or shepherd role has now been replaced by a much more egalitarian model of community care for each other, communal, contextual pastoral care. This model of care, as well as bringing a much keener sense of public and community response to pastoral care situations, also challenges the power relationship that the shepherd model brings. But most of us, I think, recognise that in a context where the community cares for each other, there are still situations that require the skilled accompaniment of a professional minister. And this kind of triage approach can, in my view, create a bigger divide between the ordained and unordained pastoral giver. Eugene Peterson, a minister who has been a blessing to so many pastors, expresses a deep concern about the professionalization of ministry in America in his memoir, The Pastor. In the closing chapter, he describes some of his concerns in a letter to a younger pastor. He says, "The proud for me are those pastors who look like they know what they are doing, who are competent and recognized as such, who have an honored position in society and among their colleagues. And going astray after false gods amounts to living in response to something manageable, turning my vocation into a depersonalized job that I can get good at." The risk of this kind of self-confidence and lack of vulnerability is certainly an unattractive downside to any professionalism. But whether competence in the main areas of ministry leads to this kind of attitude is an assumption that I think demands a robust critique. I think that Peterson voices a fear that we as English Baptists have had for centuries, that any kind of professionalisation of ministry can lead to an unhelpful self-sufficiency rather than a vulnerable reliance on the Holy Spirit. And this was certainly a fear voiced in the 18th century when training ministers became a crucial issue for English Baptists. The fear that becoming competent would bypass the work of the Holy Spirit can still be detected in Peterson's words. The idea that competence and professionalism throws up some sort of barrier between a minister and the people they serve is also implied. And yet, the very distance and depersonalization that Peterson deplores may sometimes be what is needed, as Nigel Wright explains in his book, How to Be a Church Minister. He says, "At a painful funeral of a loved person, it does not help those who grieve if ministers give way to their own grief. For the sake of everybody getting through, they should command their own emotions and be professional." This tension between being approachable and walking with people in their life events and yet holding a place that is set apart is, I believe, at the heart of our difficulty with professionalism in ministry. It lies behind the need to be competent and yet also fully reliant on the Holy Spirit, and perhaps explains why, in comparison with other caring professions, we invest so little in in-field training and supervision. Are we afraid of interrupting what the Holy Spirit might do by supervising practical learning and training? At the end of my RGN training, a third of my final examination was devoted to the teaching and assessing of others. And before I could take up my ward sister's post, I had to complete a degree module in teaching and assessing nurses and healthcare assistants. In contrast, I do not remember receiving any teaching at college on how I would pass on my skills as a minister to any future ministers in training that I might supervise. My own training was an inconsistent experience of some exemplary and some non-existent and even damaging supervision. This kind of inconsistency does not help us to produce good ministers. In an era when time at college is getting squeezed into 1 day a week for most ministers in training, how we support and train those ministers in their churches is more important than ever. This disparity and confusion around professionalism and the potential benefits of embracing our own form of professionalism in Baptist ministry is what has prompted my research. I hope and pray that this project will lead towards a kinder, more supportive form of professionalism. I believe that this will most likely require the denomination to look again at some kind of standardisation of training within the different formation paths offered by our Baptist colleges. It will perhaps be helpful to look more closely at other professions and their ability to support and train in the field, and how we can better equip experienced ministers to supervise and encourage ministers in training. But I also believe that we need to look again at our professional identity as Baptist ministers, to willingly take on certain traits of professionalism that might actually make us more secure and improve the quality of our practice in the church and the world at large. I have 4 suggestions. The first is supporting each other in intentional lifelong learning communities. A key issue in learning in any profession is whether or not the learning environment is safe. Safe to make mistakes, safe to ask questions, safe to grow. Whilst there has always been a muted acceptance that ministers need to commit to lifelong learning, until recently, with the instigation of the Continuous Ministerial Development Programme, this has not had an organised structure. Now, with the beginning of supportive peer relationships in our commitment to lifelong learning, we have an opportunity to grow our professional confidence. Being able to flag up areas that we are less experienced and confident in is the first step towards sharing skills and knowledge, and can only benefit our ministers and churches. Secondly, standardising training for key events in ministry. While standardisation can be restrictive, it can also be liberating. Providing a standardised way of carrying out ministerial recognition interviews has been a positive experience for my particular Baptist association, and means that we do at least have an explicit expectation of what that process should involve across the denomination. As the key moments in ministry still provide the moments where we are most on show to the world, infant dedications, marriages and funerals, would it not be wise to ensure that a basic understanding and standard of ministry was taught and assessed by all our Baptist colleges and followed through into the churches themselves? These key moments can, if done well, be helpful missional opportunities. So why would we not invest in making sure we all do them well? I can't believe that it would be that hard to devise a model of assessment for such moments that would give guidance and confidence to the minister in training and protect the public from well-meaning but ill-equipped ministers. Thirdly, providing support and assessment of those key tasks in the field. As I've already suggested, time at college is precious and scarce. Most of what we learn as ministers in training is experienced and consolidated in the congregation or pioneering setting. And yet our provision of supervision is not routinely assessed and can be very variable in its helpfulness. Mentors provide an invaluable sounding board in the training and newly accredited phase of formation, but this rarely takes the form of actually walking with the minister through a first funeral or wedding. Fear of being on the receiving end of patriarchal and patronising help may result in reluctance to ask for help in the future, whereas training ministers to support and pass on knowledge in an empowering way could nurture the kind of professionals who are secure enough to learn from each other. Which leads to my last point, training all ministers to train each other. When passing on knowledge and skills becomes a normal part of who we are, we can abandon the hierarchical pattern of teacher and learner and instead adopt the much more positive professionalism of sharing skills and knowledge. None of us will have the same experience, and all of us will have a different angle or view to helpfully bring to any pastoral situation. Becoming a profession that can share that learning together probably needs to start in the colleges, but can be nurtured in ministers' groups, clusters, NAM sessions, and CMD support structures. And dare I say, even through Facebook groups. I am sure that some of this does indeed happen, but I feel we must go much further. Recently retired ministers and ministers with backgrounds in teaching or other professions have a wealth of experience which could be used more widely and which we are not paying enough attention to. And so in conclusion, I would argue for a very specific form of professionalism in Baptist ministry. My own regional minister, Jeff Colmer, our current president, has a phrase which I have always found challenging and inspiring. He talks about the minister always being the calmest person in the room. This is not easy, and yet I think we can all aspire to be that calm presence that is able to be competent and trustworthy, whilst still being wholly attentive to the situation and what God is saying in it. It is this professional, holy space that I would like us to aim for. A space gained through the hard work of training, the rigours of formation, and the openness to the Spirit that these two disciplines can release. It is in this holy space that I believe we can find a new confidence and a secure identity. How many of us have sat in ecumenical meetings and found ourselves the poor relation because our state church colleagues seem to hold a more professionally secure space? In these days of mistrust in institutions and government, perhaps it is the nonconformist moment. Perhaps this is our time to step into a secure public identity and use those professional skills that we can offer people at the key moments of their lives: birth, marriage, death, and loss. But I also think that we can be aiming towards something much kinder and supportive than we perhaps have offered each other before. The various Facebook groups for ministers give us a glimpse of both the best and worst of what a professional, nurturing community can offer. It should not be a place where we all moan about our lot, and yet it can be a place where we can be vulnerable enough to own our particular knowledge and experience deficits and learn from each other for the benefit of our congregations and those who have yet to join them. The word professional has so many difficulties for Baptist ministers, but that elusive state of confidence with humility and vulnerability is something I believe is worth striving for.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Questions? Simon, could you read out a couple?
Yeah, just a couple from online. We've had a number of comments online as well, but just a couple of questions. Firstly, does one's understanding of professionalism presuppose any particular theology of ordination?
I think the question of, are we ontologically changed is unspoken but very much there, isn't it? I've always held the view that if we are not ontologically changed, I'm not sure what we've been doing for 3 years of training. I felt ontologically changed when I put on my uniform for the first time as a nurse, and again when I put on my staff nurse's uniform, and again when I put on my sister's uniform. And I certainly felt like I was a different person when I became ordained. So I think we can encompass a wide range of theology around this and still agree that if we aren't a changed person by the end of our training, then perhaps there's something missing. I think that's probably what I want to say about that.
Okay, there are loads more questions. We've got about 2 minutes, so I'm not going to try and do them justice. Maybe take one from in the room.
Thank you. I think there's a couple of...
And if we can make sure those questions get saved and passed on to speakers.
That'd be helpful.
Yes.
On your points of how to do things, you said support and assessment of key in fields. I was thinking, how do you assess and support the lay minister who is not trained, who has never been to college, and yet is the only person in the community that does weddings and funerals?
Yeah.
How do we support them?
I think there's a role for associations to be much more organised about how they support their lay ministers. I was a lay minister for 2 years before I went to train. I did the Equipped to Minister course, and that's what shocked me about it. I did my first funeral after I'd done one Saturday at Spurgeon's, and we hadn't talked about death or anything. So I think that's a very real problem, and something that associations could be more organised about supporting, offering training. We have Footsteps in our association, which is a great way of training lay people, but I think we could be more organised about how we support them. And assess sounds like a very punitive word, but I would want it to be a releasing experience. Someone coming to watch you do and saying, that was great, have you, this is really good, could you share this knowledge with someone else, could someone come and share it with you, I think could liberate us all as lay and ordained ministers.
Thank you. And I think we've got time for one cheeky one at the back. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. When we came out of college, the thing I observed, and I think what Peterson and I know John Piper wrote a similar critique from a very different perspective about the idea of professionalism, was the distance that had been placed between ministers and their congregations. I mean, basically, the NAM conference was people whinging about their church for 2 days solid and treating them like clients, which is how I used to treat my clients when I was a lawyer.
Yeah.
Or I noticed doctors and nurses talk about their patients, teachers talk about their pupils, like there's somebody else who I'm serving as a job. I wonder if you could comment on how your idea of increased professionalism actually helps to combat that rather than entrench it.
Yeah.
60 seconds.
Okay. Even as a nurse, I was a bit of an outlier in terms of professionalism not being a barrier. Sometimes that barrier is useful. Sometimes I wish I had a uniform that I could take off at the end of the day. I don't anymore. But for me, the embodiment of professionalism is getting closer to that person, because I've used those skills to kind of forget myself in the scenario and be completely tuned into what that other person needs. On my best days as a nurse, my most professional days as a nurse, that's the space I occupied, and I hope and pray that on my most professional days as a minister, it's more about the person in front of me and me being closer to them and seeing what the Holy Spirit is doing in them than creating a barrier.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Now taking a slight turn from